In 1953, the CIA helped overthrow the democratically elected government of Iran. 26 years later, the same country that orchestrated that coup watched its embassy stormed and 52 of its citizens taken hostage for 444 days. How did Iran and the United States go from secret allies to bitter enemies in one generation? This is the story of oil, power, faith, and betrayal, the story of how the Cold War turned Iran into one of America's most enduring nightmares. To understand why Iran and the United States became entangled in one of the 20th century's most consequential relationships, you have to start not in Washington, but in the oil fields of southwestern Iran, where for decades a British company extracted the country's most valuable resource while paying its people a fraction of its worth. By the early 1940s, Iran sat at a dangerous crossroads. The country was nominally independent, ruled by the young Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had inherited the throne in 1941 after Britain and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Iran and forced his father, Reza Shah, into exile, fearing the elder Shah's sympathies toward Nazi Germany threatened their wartime supply lines. The two great powers occupied Iran for the duration of the Second World War, using the Trans-Iranian Railway to funnel supplies to the Soviet Red Army. Iran, in effect, became a corridor for other nations' wars, a pattern that would repeat itself for decades. When the war ended in 1945, both Britain and the Soviet Union had promised to withdraw their troops. Britain complied. The Soviet Union did not. Stalin's forces lingered in northern Iran, propping up two short-lived separatist states, the Azerbaijan People's Government and the Kurdish Republic of Mohabbat, raising fears in Washington that Iran might become the first domino in a Soviet push toward the oil-rich Persian Gulf. It was this crisis, resolved only through a combination of Iranian diplomacy, United Nations pressure, and American backing, that some historians consider one of the opening confrontations of the Cold War itself. The United States, still finding its footing as a global superpower, began to see Iran not as a peripheral country but as a strategic linchpin, a buffer between Soviet ambition and the oil reserves that fueled the post-war world. Yet the deeper tension in Iran was not between Washington and Moscow, but between Iranians and the British. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later known as British Petroleum, controlled the extraction, refining, and sale of Iranian oil through a 1933 concession that Iranians increasingly viewed as colonial exploitation dressed in the language of contract law. The company's refinery at Abadan was, at the time, the largest in the world, yet Iranian workers lived in conditions of poverty alongside British engineers who enjoyed segregated clubs, swimming pools, and salaries Iranians could only imagine. Profits flowed to London. A nationalist movement, simmering since the early 20th century, found its voice in a coalition of merchants, clergy, and secular reformers united by a single demand: Iranian oil for Iranians. The man who would crystallize this movement was Mohammad Mossadegh, an aristocratic lawyer and parliamentarian whose opposition to foreign domination of Iran's resources stretched back decades. Mossadegh was not a communist, a point Western observers would later obscure or forget, but a fierce nationalist and committed constitutionalist who believed Iran's parliament, not the Shah or a foreign company, should determine the nation's destiny. In 1951, after sustained public pressure and a parliamentary vote, Iran's National Assembly nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The Shah, under pressure, appointed Mossadegh as prime minister. For ordinary Iranians, it was a moment of extraordinary pride. A small, formerly colonized nation had stood up to the British Empire and reclaimed its own resource. Britain reacted with fury. London organized an international boycott of Iranian oil, froze Iranian assets, and pulled its technicians from Abadan, crippling the country's oil industry and devastating its economy. British officials began quietly exploring how the Mossadegh government might be removed. Initially, the United States under President Harry Truman resisted British pressure to intervene, viewing Mossadegh as a nationalist reformer rather than a Soviet threat, and worrying that a coup would simply validate Soviet propaganda about Western imperialism in the developing world. Truman's administration even attempted to broker a compromise between Britain and Iran over oil revenues, but the negotiations collapsed amid mutual intransigence. Everything changed with the 1952 election of Dwight D. Eisenhower. The new administration, shaped by the anti-communist fervor of the early Cold War and influenced by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles, the new CIA director, took a starkly different view. Britain's intelligence service, MI6, had already drafted a plan to remove Mossadegh, but lacked the operatives on the ground after Mossadegh expelled British diplomats in 1952. London needed an American partner, and found one eager to act. The justification shifted. Mossadegh, increasingly reliant on support from Iran's Communist Tudeh party to maintain his parliamentary coalition, was recast not as a nationalist but as a gateway to Soviet influence, regardless of how accurate that characterization actually was. In the summer of 1953, the CIA and MI6 launched Operation Ajax, a covert effort to depose Mossadegh and restore the Shah's full authority, working through Iranian military officers, paid agitators, and propaganda operations designed to turn public opinion and the army against the prime minister. The first attempt, in mid-August, nearly failed disastrously. The Shah briefly fled the country, and it appeared the operation had collapsed entirely. But within days, CIA operative Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, orchestrated a second wave, paid crowds, sympathetic military units, and a coordinated show of force that overwhelmed Mossadegh's defenses. On August 19, 1953, pro-Shah forces stormed key government buildings. Mossadegh was arrested, later tried for treason, and spent his remaining years under house arrest until his death in 1967. The Shah returned from exile to a throne now underwritten by American power. For Washington, the operation was, in the short term, a strategic triumph. Iran remained firmly within the Western orbit, its oil flowed to international markets through a new multinational consortium that included American companies for the first time, and a Cold War ally was secured along the Soviet Union's southern border. But the coup planted something far more consequential than a geopolitical win, a deep and lasting Iranian conviction that the United States, the nation that had once seemed a benevolent counterweight to British and Soviet imperialism, had instead chosen to crush Iranian democracy when it proved inconvenient. That conviction would not fade. It would deepen, generation after generation, until it detonated in ways few in Washington anticipated. In the aftermath of the 1953 coup, the United States did not merely help restore Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to his throne, it began building one of the most extensive and consequential patron-client relationships of the entire Cold War, one that would bind Iran's monarchy to American strategic interests so tightly that the two became, in the eyes of much of the Iranian public, virtually indistinguishable. Washington's logic was straightforward by the standards of Cold War containment doctrine. Iran shared a long border with the Soviet Union, sat atop some of the world's largest oil reserves, and occupied a position astride the Persian Gulf that made it indispensable to Western energy security. A stable, pro-Western Iran was, in American strategic thinking, worth almost any price. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, the United States provided Iran with substantial military and economic assistance, trained Iranian officers in American war colleges, and helped establish and shape SAVAK, the Shah's secret police, founded in 1957 with direct CIA assistance in its early organizational structure and training methods. SAVAK would go on to become one of the most feared internal security services in the Middle East, responsible for the surveillance, arrest, interrogation, and in many documented cases the torture of the Shah's political opponents, a record that international human rights organizations and journalists increasingly documented and condemned through the 1960s and 1970s. For the Shah, American backing was the foundation upon which he built an increasingly autocratic style of rule. In 1963, he launched what he called the White Revolution, a sweeping program of land reform, female suffrage, literacy campaigns, and industrial modernization explicitly modeled on the idea that rapid, top-down development could inoculate Iran against the kind of leftist revolutionary movements then spreading across the developing world. American advisors, economists, and development theorists, drawing on Cold War-era modernization theory popular in Washington academic and policy circles, directly influenced aspects of this program, seeing it as a showcase for how a pro-Western monarchy could deliver prosperity without succumbing to communism. Some of these reforms genuinely transformed Iranian society, literacy rates rose, infrastructure expanded, and a new urban middle class began to emerge in Tehran and other major cities. But the White Revolution also generated fierce opposition, much of it rooted in ways the Shah's American-aligned advisors badly underestimated. Land reform disrupted traditional rural power structures, including those tied to the Shura clergy, who controlled significant religious endowment lands. Rapid urbanization uprooted millions of Iranians from traditional village life and deposited them into sprawling, underserved city slums, creating exactly the kind of social dislocation that bred resentment rather than gratitude. And the Shah's increasingly personalist, authoritarian style of governance, banning meaningful political opposition, jailing dissidents, and centralizing power around his own court, meant there were no legitimate political channels through which this growing discontent could be expressed. It was in this climate, in 1963, that a relatively obscure cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini delivered a fiery sermon denouncing the Shah's reforms and his subservience to American and Israeli interests, leading to his arrest and, eventually, his exile, first to Turkey, then to Iraq, and finally to France. Few in Washington or Tehran paid him much attention. That, too, would prove a catastrophic miscalculation. Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, the U.S. Iran relationship deepened through arms sales on a staggering scale. By the early 1970s, particularly after the 1973 oil crisis quadrupled global oil prices and filled Iran's treasury with petrodollars, the Shah began purchasing American military hardware at a pace that alarmed even some U.S. officials. F-14 fighter jets, advanced naval vessels, and sophisticated weapons systems flowed into Iran in quantities that made it, by the mid-1970s, one of the largest purchasers of American arms in the world. President Richard Nixon's administration, formalizing what became known as the Nixon Doctrine, explicitly designated Iran as a regional policeman meant to project American-aligned power across the Persian Gulf without requiring direct U.S. military deployment, a role the Shah embraced with evident enthusiasm, intervening militarily in Oman's Dhofar rebellion and positioning Iran as the dominant military power in the Gulf. Yet beneath this picture of strategic partnership and economic dynamism, Iranian society was fracturing in ways that the close relationship between the Shah and successive American administrations actively obscured from Washington's view. Income inequality widened even as the country grew wealthier in aggregate terms. Corruption among the Shah's inner circle and royal family became a subject of open resentment. Savak's reach extended into universities, mosques, and even into Iranian student communities abroad, creating a pervasive climate of fear that suppressed dissent without eliminating its underlying causes. Religious leaders, secular nationalists, and leftist intellectuals, groups with little in common ideologically, found themselves increasingly united by a shared opposition to a monarchy that seemed to rule not for Iranians, but for the continuation of an American-aligned status quo. American diplomats stationed in Tehran, along with the CIA stationed there, would later be criticized for failing to recognize the depth of this opposition, partly because the Shah's own intelligence services filtered and sanitized the information that reached Washington, and partly because successive American administrations, from Eisenhower through Nixon, Ford, and into Jimmy Carter's early presidency, had grown so accustomed to viewing the Shah as an indispensable and stable ally that warning signs were persistently discounted. By the mid-1970s, the United States and Iran appeared, on the surface, closer than at any point in their history, bound by oil, arms, and a shared anti-communist strategic vision. President Carter, visiting Tehran on New Year's Eve in 1977, famously toasted the Shah, calling Iran an island of stability in a turbulent region. Within little more than a year, that island would begin to sink, and the United States would find itself utterly unprepared for what was coming. By 1977, the foundations of the Shah's rule, propped up for nearly a quarter-century by American support, had grown far more brittle than anyone in Washington understood. What followed over the next 4 years would not just end a monarchy, it would permanently sever the strategic partnership between Iran and the United States and inaugurate a hostility that persists into the present day. The crisis began gradually, then accelerated with stunning speed. Economic strain from inflation, uneven development, and growing public anger over corruption combined with President Carter's human rights-focused foreign policy, which created just enough political space for the Shah's opponents to organize more openly than they had in years. Throughout 1977 and into 1978, protests grew, fueled by an unlikely coalition: secular nationalists, leftist students, merchants angered by economic mismanagement, and, increasingly central to the movement's organizing power, networks of mosques and clergy loyal to the exiled Ayatollah Khomeini, who from his base in Najaf, Iraq, and later Neauphle-le-Château, France, used smuggled cassette tapes of his sermons to galvanize opposition inside Iran itself. A pivotal moment arrived in January 1978, when Iranian security forces killed protesters in the holy city of Qom, triggering a cycle of mourning processions, further crackdowns, and further deaths that repeated itself roughly every 40 days in accordance with Sharia mourning traditions, each cycle drawing larger crowds and harder repression. By the autumn of 1978, strikes had paralyzed Iran's oil industry, the very resource at the heart of the U.S. Iran relationship for decades, while millions marched in Tehran demanding the Shah's abdication. The Shah, increasingly indecisive and, unknown to most observers at the time, already suffering from the cancer that would eventually kill him, alternated between repression and concession in ways that satisfied no one and emboldened the opposition further. Washington's response throughout this period was marked by confusion and internal division. President Carter's administration was split between officials who urged the Shah to crack down decisively to preserve the regime, and others, including parts of the State Department, who argued that human rights considerations and the realities on the ground made the Shah's position untenable, urging instead a negotiated transition. This lack of a coherent American strategy meant that the United States sent mixed and often contradictory signals to the Shah at the exact moment he most needed clarity, contributing to a sense of paralysis at the highest levels of the Iranian state. By January 1979, recognizing the situation was unsalvageable, the Shah left Iran, ostensibly for medical treatment and a temporary vacation, but in reality never to return. 2 weeks later, on February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Tehran after 14 years in exile, greeted by crowds estimated in the millions, and within days the last vestiges of the monarchy's government collapsed entirely. The Islamic Revolution that followed was not a single, unified movement but a coalition that included secular leftists, nationalists, and Islamists, all of whom had cooperated to topple the Shah but held sharply divergent visions for what should replace him. Over the following months, Khomeini and his allies systematically outmaneuvered and marginalized their former revolutionary partners, establishing the framework for what would become the Islamic Republic, ratified by referendum in the spring of 1979 and formalized with a new constitution that placed ultimate authority in the hands of the supreme leader, a role Khomeini himself assumed. For the United States, the revolution was a profound strategic shock, but the relationship's complete collapse came a few months later, triggered by a decision the Carter administration made with full awareness of its risks. In October 1979, facing pressure from influential figures including former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and banking interests with long-standing ties to the Shah, Carter allowed the exiled and gravely ill Shah to enter the United States for cancer treatment at a New York hospital. To many Iranians, already deeply suspicious that the United States was plotting to engineer another 1953-style restoration of the Shah, this decision confirmed their worst fears and reignited revolutionary fervor against what was popularly called the Great Satan. On November 4, 1979, a group of Iranian students, with the implicit or explicit backing of factions within the new revolutionary government, stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran, taking 66 American personnel hostage. 52 of them would remain in captivity for 444 days, in a crisis that dominated American political life, defined the final year of Carter's presidency, and became, for an entire generation of Americans, the symbol of Iran itself. The hostage-takers, and the revolutionary government that ultimately endorsed their action, framed the seizure as retribution for decades of American interference in Iranian affairs, explicitly invoking the memory of the 1953 coup as justification, a direct, unmistakable line drawn between Operation Ajax and the embassy takeover, demonstrating how deeply that earlier act of covert intervention had embedded itself in Iranian political consciousness across a generation. The crisis that followed exposed the limits of American power in ways that shocked the public. Diplomatic negotiations dragged on without resolution. In April 1980, a daring military rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw, ended in disaster in the Iranian desert when mechanical failures and a collision between aircraft killed 8 American servicemen before they ever reached Tehran, a humiliation that further damaged Carter's political standing and, many historians argue, contributed significantly to his defeat in the 1980 presidential election. The hostages were finally released on January 20, 1981, the very day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president, following the Algiers Accords, a negotiated settlement that unfroze billions of dollars in Iranian assets in exchange for the hostages' freedom, but which resolved none of the underlying animosity between the two nations. By the start of 1981, the transformation was complete. A relationship built across nearly 3 decades on oil, arms, and shared Cold War strategic interests had been replaced by something far more adversarial, mutual distrust, ideological hostility, and a legacy of grievance on both sides that neither government would meaningfully overcome for the remainder of the 20th century, and arguably not into the 21st. The release of the American hostages in January 1981 did not end the conflict between Iran and the United States. it merely marked the beginning of a new phase, one fought not through embassies and diplomacy but through proxy conflicts, covert operations, economic warfare, and a deep ideological hostility that would outlast the Cold War itself and continue shaping the Middle East for decades. The first and most consequential arena of this new conflict was the Iran-Iraq War, which began in September 1980 when Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein, calculating that Iran's revolutionary chaos had left it militarily vulnerable, launched a surprise invasion aimed at seizing disputed border territory and the strategically vital Shatt al-Arab waterway. What Saddam expected to be a quick victory instead became one of the longest and bloodiest conventional wars of the 20th century, lasting 8 years and resulting in casualties estimated at between 500,000 and 1 million people on both sides combined. For the United States, the war presented a complicated strategic calculation. Washington had no love for Iran's revolutionary government, but neither did it wish to see Saddam's Iraq emerge as an unchecked regional hegemon. The result was a policy of pragmatic, often cynical balancing. The Reagan administration restored diplomatic relations with Iraq in 1984 and provided Baghdad with intelligence, agricultural credits, and indirect support, even as documented evidence later confirmed that Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranian forces, a fact that did not initially derail the American-Iraqi relationship during the war itself. Simultaneously, in one of the most bizarre and damaging episodes in the history of American foreign policy, the Reagan administration secretly authorized arms sales to Iran in the mid-1980s, ostensibly to encourage Iranian moderates and secure the release of American hostages held by Iranian-backed militants in Lebanon, even while publicly maintaining an arms embargo against Iran and condemning the country as a sponsor of terrorism. The profits from these covert arms sales were then illegally diverted to fund the Contra rebels fighting the leftist government in Nicaragua, a Cold War proxy conflict entirely unrelated to Iran itself. When journalists exposed this operation in late 1986, the resulting Iran-Contra scandal severely damaged the Reagan presidency, led to congressional hearings, and revealed to the American public just how tangled, contradictory, and often unaccountable American policy toward Iran had become in the years following the hostage crisis. For Iran's leadership, the episode served as further proof, regardless of how they had quietly tried to use the arrangement to their own advantage, that the United States operated through duplicity and self-interest rather than principle. Tensions between the two countries also played out directly in the Persian Gulf itself. As the Iran-Iraq War dragged into its later years, both combatants targeted oil tankers in what became known as the Tanker War, drawing the United States into direct naval confrontation with Iran to protect international shipping and, implicitly, the flow of Gulf oil to Western markets. This culminated in a series of direct clashes in 1987 and 1988, including American naval strikes against Iranian oil platforms and a major naval engagement in April 1988 in which U.S. forces sank or damaged several Iranian vessels. The most tragic episode of this confrontation occurred in July 1988, when the USS Vincennes, operating in the Strait of Hormuz amid the heightened tensions of the tanker war, mistakenly shot down Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian Iranian passenger jet, killing all 290 people aboard. The United States described the shootdown as a tragic accident resulting from a misidentification under combat conditions, a characterization the U.S. government later affirmed through compensation payments, but one that many Iranians have never accepted as a genuine mistake, viewing it instead as emblematic of American disregard for Iranian lives. A perception that hardened anti-American sentiment in Iran for years afterward. Throughout this period, the United States also began constructing the architecture of economic pressure that would come to define its primary tool against Iran for the following decades. Beginning with asset freezes during the hostage crisis itself and expanding through subsequent administrations, Washington progressively imposed economic sanctions on Iran, citing the country's support for groups the United States designated as terrorist organizations, its human rights record, and later its nuclear program, which became the central flashpoint of the relationship from the early 2000s onward. Iran, for its part, embedded its hostility toward the United States into the ideological foundation of the Islamic Republic itself, with anti-American rhetoric becoming a recurring and politically useful feature of the regime's domestic legitimacy, deployed by hardline factions especially during moments of internal political vulnerability. By the time the Cold War formally ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the original strategic logic that had bound Iran and the United States together for nearly 3 decades, the shared fear of Soviet expansion into the Persian Gulf, had become entirely irrelevant. Yet the hostility between the two nations not only survived the Cold War's end, it had become self-sustaining, rooted now in revolutionary ideology, historical grievance, regional rivalry, and an accumulated record of mutual betrayal that neither side could easily set aside. The 1953 coup, the Shah's repression, the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war maneuvering, Iran-Contra, and the tanker confrontations had collectively transformed what began as a Cold War alliance of convenience into one of the most intractable enmities in modern international relations, a rupture whose consequences continue to shape the Middle East, global energy politics, and American foreign policy debates well into the 21st century.